Is CANZUK a good idea? That's the title of the video. I'm assuming if you click this video, you know what CANZUK is. CANZUK is pretty much a hypothetical, so currently non-existent union between Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the UK. And talks about CANZUK really intensified after Brexit because the UK was left stranded and alone out of its own volition pretty much, and obviously Canada, Australia, and New Zealand in particular are countries that are actually quite similar to the UK, definitely more so than the US, just by the fact that they gained their independence later. They have a more similar political system. They still have the King of England as also the King of Canada, the King of New Zealand, and the King of Australia, and also contrary to other countries that England colonized, those three countries have similar standards of living to England. So, well, if the EU works and if other common economic blocks also work, and if in a world where there's more and more free trade agreements with like different regions just sort of competing for power, the UK, it's not anymore feasible for the UK to just stand alone. But also a lot of those countries, not only the UK, but especially Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, they've always been in that Anglosphere that in the past 50 to 100 years has really been dominated by the US. And it just so happens that the population in those countries isn't exactly happy with what the US is doing right now, with how America's putting itself forth. And so obviously individually, country with the most population out of those four is the UK, with around 60 million people, but it's still only a fifth of the US. And the other countries, so Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they actually have even smaller populations than that. And so to compete culturally and economically just on an individual basis with the US is there's not much hope of that. But well, if they happen to unite, and that by that I don't mean necessarily politically, right, but economically, through free trade, through especially freedom of movement, so people in those countries could just move between themselves, they could unite their voices into something that's a little bit more, let's say, more heard internationally speaking. And obviously it's a very interesting thought. An interesting mention is that it's actually quite popular if you ask people like on the streets, are you interested in some sort of union between those four countries? And every single one of those four countries, the majority say yes. And I think the UK is actually the one where at least amount of people say yes, whereas I think New Zealand was the one where it was most popular. So you can see that it's an idea that's definitely out there, and there's been talks a few years ago of that being an official position for the Conservative Party of Canada, but it does have its challenges. And I think the main challenge right now is that, especially after Brexit, where those talks actually became relevant, we've been having in the last 10 years or so a very national movement worldwide, not just in America, not just in individual European countries, but really throughout the world, in Latin America, and the globalization end of history kind of theme that was so popular in the 1990s and in the 2000s, which was very which propitiated the more closer economic ties of the EU or NAFTA or other trading blocs. That frame definitely isn't there anymore. And the reason why it isn't there anymore is because people are actually wanting to identify more with their own countries, and there's more anti-immigration sentiments, and even in countries that are really, really similar, like Canada, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand, where the demographics are really similar, the standards of living are really similar, just this overall let's say repugnation or denial of greater authority or of supranational bodies or of unchecked open immigration is obviously something that more and more people have seen, have frowned upon, let's say. And that is definitely a problem. Me personally, I've a particular story with CANZUK because I'm not actually a citizen of any of the CANZUK countries, but I lived in the UK when I was a kid, I lived in Canada when I was a teenager, and I live in Australia now. I've also been to New Zealand for the first time a few months ago, so I've definitely had the opportunity to move around between those countries. And one thing that I definitely do believe is that they're immensely similar. They really do share a culture, and in certain moments of my life, if you just take particular pictures, or let's say, or images, that I have in my memory, it's actually even hard to define where within those 4 countries I actually am, because they truly are very similar. Obviously, the climates and weather are actually quite different, but this underlying British Anglo theme is something very relevant. And one thing that I've talked in a previous video is about a certain opportunity that CANZUK actually poses, which is I think the West is kind of tired of the EU versus US dichotomy, because those are pretty much the 2 main models through which we view the world as Westerners. You can be more of a welfare state with more social services and a bit of a larger middle class with less social mobility in the case of Europe, or you can be more of a winner takes all, more risk loving kind of culture, which we find in the US. Some people like more of the US, some people more like more of the EU, but a lot of people are actually frustrated with, for example, all the bureaucracy in the EU, or with all the limitations the EU imposes. And obviously in the US, things like gun crime or healthcare problems are very real. It's a violent country, and so to have this official third option, let's say, of CANZUK, which now, if they actually joined, wouldn't be just a few individual countries, but an actual bloc with over 150 million citizens, or at least residents. That's actually something to be that could actually confront the US and EU hegemony, let's say, and actually pose a third way, a third option, a third route, where obviously those countries, they have a little bit more of a social system like the EU, but they're normally less bureaucratic. They have lower tax rates. Even when the marginal tax rate is high, it actually applies to a little bit of a higher income. And so those countries, they have a bit of both routes, and they could give a very solid third option, not just for immigration itself, but also a third option for conversation in the West, with a more nuanced opinion that is not just you either are America or you are like Europe. No, you can have a third option as well. I think that would really help dialogue. I think a lot of young people in those countries would be it would be beneficial to them. Obviously, a lot of those countries already have working holiday schemes, but to have an even more open freedom of movement would definitely be beneficial. And I see that here between Australia and New Zealand, with a lot of Kiwis coming to Australia, it's a very good cultural exchange, and it's, I believe, an alliance, at least between Australia and New Zealand, that people couldn't possibly not seen existing in the future. And that's all that CANZUK is, really. It's already the framework that is between New Zealand and Australia. You just extend it to Canada and the UK as well. You don't have to have a common currency. You don't have to have a supranational body. You don't have to have rules or regulation. You can just have the freedom of movement with maybe some sort of agreement as to how welfare will work between citizens, like New Zealand and Australia already have. And that's it. You don't need a CANZUK parliament. You don't need a common tax frame. You don't need any of that. You just need free movement of people, goods, labor, obviously, and free trade, let's call it that. And I think that would greatly benefit all of those 4 countries. I think it's a very interesting idea. I still think it's a very popular idea, but I also think it's a very unlikely idea. So I'd love to see what you guys think. Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you guys around.